Hey everybody, today I want to talk about hardware and D5 render. And really, this video is all about how can you improve the performance of D5 render by picking out the correct parts for your PC or laptop. So I want to break down what the system requirements are, my recommendations, and what are really good specs so you get the best out of D5. So let's get started. So if you literally have no idea what's in your computer in terms of like components and all that, if you go over to the D5 launcher and you click right here where it says version number, click that, and this will give you the system information. You guys are always asking me, what are your system specs? This is what I've got. So this will actually give you a benchmark, which basically tells you if you are at the minimum spec or beyond the recommended spec. Obviously, based on budget and other constraints, you really want to be around here. This is going to give you the smoothest experience, and it's going to let you handle much larger files. I'm not saying you can't work over here. It's just think about the type of work you're doing. If you're doing master plans and aerials all the time, you need to be over here. If you're doing like small one family houses, yeah, you could probably get away with this, but keep in mind, things might take longer. I'll actually show you the difference between a better GPU and a lesser GPU. So anyways, that's how you check that. So by default, D5, they say these are the requirements, okay? So they're talking about a GTX 1060, came out such a long time ago. Hopefully you guys are using something with a little bit more memory. 6 gigabytes of video RAM is not much. The recommended value is 12 gigs, so it's basically double this. So pay attention to that. If you're curious what models D5 supports, they actually have a handy page. It's called System Requirements for D5 Render, just like the other one. And this lists all the different GPUs. In my opinion, you should probably have an RTX card. So one of the reasons you want an RTX card is you'll actually get some extra settings right here. Super resolution and FPS booster. You're not going to get this if you don't have an RTX card. Because D5 Render works so well with NVIDIA tech, we're going to get these extra features, and with the release of the new 5000 GPUs, D5 Render actually got a shout out because they're using DLSS 4, and that's where you're getting the super resolution from. So it's kind of a nice comparison, but you could see we're expecting like huge performance increases. But this is my point. Try and find an RTX card. With these coming out, your 4000 series will be much cheaper. So if you don't know what I'm talking about with the 4000 series, if you look here, you basically have the generation. So 2 is basically at this point of recording before the 5000s is basically 2 generations old. Then you have the 3000s and then the 4000s, which are the latest. But of course the 5000 are to be announced. Then here, the second or the last 2 numbers is basically the tier, right? So if I were to go down here, 3050 bottom tier, 3050 Ti is like a little upgrade. It's not like a crazy upgrade. We're talking about like 5 to 8% typically. Then you've got your 3060s, your 3070s, 3080, and 3090. But you could see after the value, there's actually the gig spec. So D5 actually recommends you have above 12 gigs of RAM. Some of these cards come in different variations, right? So again, this is the number you're looking for. And if you do any shopping, it's going to list what this is. So that's actually why I've brought up the Best Buy webpage just to show you what a real world scenario would look like. So let me just click this just so you can see. If you scroll down a bit, you're going to see something that says show full specs. Okay, so this is going to tell you everything about the computer. When it comes to the video RAM, right, you're going to want to go down to graphics and you'll see it says 12 gigabytes. Okay, so that's where we want to be about. Obviously, if your budget can't afford that, 8 gigs will put you in that standard area, but 12 gigs will give you, some extra bandwidth. So moving on, the next important thing is your CPU. Easiest way I can explain it. And here, they're talking about the recommended requirements being like an i5 and above. And that's equivalent to the Ryzen 3 series if you're going with AMD. Again, with your optimal requirements, i9 series is phenomenal. Same thing with Ryzen 9. If you want like an in-between recommended and optimal, the i7s are really good, and the 7 series of Ryzen, all very good. Okay, so a lot of it really comes down to the type of work you do and your budget, so keep that in mind. Next thing is RAM. Okay, I feel like we used to say 5 years ago 16 gigs of RAM was totally enough. 32 gigs of RAM is like where you need to be past that standard area and be in the recommended area, okay? On my machine, I have 64 gigs of RAM. I often deal with like a lot of large files, a lot of multitasking, a lot of different apps. So if you're doing a lot of that, bump up to 64. I think it's definitely worth it. And it's not like you're going to get a bump just to D5. It's like a bump to the whole PC experience. So use that. Upgrading your RAM is also really important. This comment's really great because when your GPU is full, like that video RAM, let's say you get an 8 gig card and it can't hold the scene, it's gonna actually shift some of that to RAM, okay? So that's why having more is nicer. There's nothing wrong with having too much, okay? So now that we've covered like the 3 main points, I wanna actually show you this fantastic benchmark tool from D5. This is basically like you download a tool, it runs the benchmark, and then it reports the performance of your computer. So this is based on rendering a 2K image. Okay, first place is, it took 19 seconds. And you'll see that the specs are the 4090. Right now, the 4090 is the king, right? Because it's the newest generation and the highest tier. That's that 9. But it also has 24 gigs of RAM. So literally double the recommended value. So that makes total sense here. And then we can see that the CPU is that i9 tier, right? So that's your highest tier when it comes to CPUs. CPUs also have multiple cores, right? And D5 recommends more cores and a higher clock speed. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, check this out. If you right click and you search and you just go to Intel or AMD site, you'll see the total cores listed right here. Think of cores as like hands. The more hands you have, the more multi-threading you can do, which means you can handle multiple operations at once. Higher is better. Same thing with the clock speed. So this is basically how fast your CPU is running. You want this to be as high as possible, right? But it's kind of like a balance. You can have less cores and a higher value, or more cores and a lesser value, and they kind of equal out. Generally, I'd like to go with a nice balance between the two. Yeah, 16 is like fantastic and like probably overkill for many applications, but keep that in mind. It only takes a quick Google search to check out the specs of these, but you'll see that a lot of these are 64 gigs, right? So this is why I'm stressing having a lot of RAM. All of this makes a big difference, and like these are god tier cards, right? So let's put in like my card, right, just so we can see what like a normal person PC would perform. So here we go. So slightly slower, 10-second slowdown, right? We've got 3080 Ti, which is the little refresh after the 3080 came out, or little boost. But you can see we've got a 12-core processor. Again, that's that 9 series, that 7 series, right? I hope you're seeing a pattern, right? So these specs, they should be paired together about the same tier, right? You don't want to get like a super amazing GPU and a crappy CPU, because then the CPU is going to bottleneck it. It's basically going to hold it back so it can't perform as well as it should. But you can see, we see a bunch of 32 gig RAMs. We don't see that 16 gig RAM on the leaderboard. So that's my point. If you want the best performance ever, try and boost that. And if you're curious about like actual performance in D5, you may have seen this, but if you go over here and you go to view and show statistics, you probably see me having this on some of my videos. You see this FPS? That's your frame rate, okay? You want this to be at 60 and above, right? What this is saying is it's refreshing 60 times per second, pretty fast. So let me open up a scene and I'll show you what happens. So while that's loading, let's talk about if you were to do some shopping, right? This is what I recommend doing, okay? Go to Best Buy, go to Micro Center, I don't know, whatever reseller you want, right? And let me just refresh all this. Any site that sells PC components or PC parts or whole PCs, right? They're going to give you little filters, okay? So given what I just told you about the different tiers, pay attention here. Obviously, the higher the tier, the more expensive it's going to be. But let's say I want like, standard performance, I might be thinking about the 60 or the 70, right? So I would just check mark one of these, and I would also check mark any of the upgrades, right? So I can grab these, okay? Then I would go down to the processor model. So this is what I was talking about. we like the i7s, we like the i9s, we like the Ryzens. I would start check marking all these. I wouldn't do the 5 if your budget really needs it. Yeah, sure. So I've got that, and then I would go down to my RAM. I would start with 32 and 64. Now that I've got that, I can start looking here and thinking about the prices. So let's see here. Let's say I'm interested in this NZXT, right? So if I click it, it's going to throw me, some other language. If you see 1 terabyte or 512 gigabytes, this is talking about the actual hard drive space. More is better. If you're curious, like how much you actually have on your current computer, you can actually do Control-Shift-Escape, and that's going to open up your task manager. And if you switch to the performance tab, it's going to list all your drives. Here, I look insane because I've got all these drives, but that's because these wonderful recordings take up so much memory. And I also play games and I like having a bunch of apps, so I need the storage. So personally, I would have as many terabytes as possible. This is also going to list your CPU specs as well. So if you don't want to go through the benchmark, you could literally click here and then see in the top right. So that's my 10700K. And then this is my GPU right here, right? And this is what I was talking about with that shared GPU memory. It can use up to 50% of what you have slotted in. I have 64 gigs. This is saying it's going to give me 32 gigs if I fill up my video RAM, right? So I've got 10 gigs. If I fill this up, which I'm almost there because I opened up a scene, it's running in the background. It's going to kind of offload here. That's what that's about. But try and get as much as possible. I wouldn't go with like a 512. I don't think it's worth it. For literally like 20, 30 bucks, you can double that. But anyways, this is like the company that makes the PC. And now you're wondering, well, what if I like laptops? Is it a big deal if I go with a laptop? Well, not really. Let's do something similar. Like if we were to select the 4070s, right? And we were to go, with our Ryzens here, our Intel cores, I'd say like back in the day, right? A good rule of thumb was like laptops were like 25% more expensive and about 25% slower for the same hardware. So if you had like a 3060, right? The 3060 was actually slower in the laptop than the desktop. And the reason being is your laptop isn't always plugged into the power. So because of that, the manufacturer has to figure out, okay, well, we need some sort of battery life performance, and we also need like rendering performance. So they've got to balance the two, right? So they'll throttle the CPU and the GPU a little bit. So basically reduce its like power. So instead of being 100%, maybe it's 80%, right? And that basically slows it down a bit, which hurts your performance a bit, but it makes your battery last longer. So that's why when you plug it in, sometimes your computer kind of like wakes up and it runs so much better. That's because it can use the power from the wall, right? Instead of its own dedicated battery. I feel like recently the pricing's actually gotten pretty competitive, but just know if you're off power, you're going to feel a little bit of slowdown, and they get really hot. People comment all the times on the video whenever they use scatter tool, like it sounds like a jet engine's launching. Well, that's because like, think of how thin a laptop is versus a desktop with like 8 fans, you know what I mean? So that's kind of like the disadvantage there. Portability is great, but just keep that in mind. You might get like a little laptop tax and, a little slowdown compared to their actual desktop counterparts, but I think you're fine either way. If you find a fantastic deal on the laptop, just go for it. With the PCs, I would just build it yourself. Watch a couple of YouTube videos and you could figure out how to build a PC. Really not that complicated. And a little perk about building your PC is like the rig I'm using right now. I have a chassis from like 2017 and I've basically like Frankenstein this thing. Whenever I need an upgrade, I swap out the necessary parts. And it's just like something I've had for, we're in 2025 now. We're almost on 10 years, with this thing. But it's crazy. So like, that's the nice thing about desktop hardware. It is upgradable to some degree. Obviously, if there's huge leaps in like, RAM going from like DDR4 to DDR5 or like, different CPU generations, you've got to like scrap a lot of parts, which is a little frustrating. But my point is, you don't need to start from scratch with desktop every time you want an upgrade. Laptops, much more difficult to upgrade. Adding some RAM isn't a big deal. Adding, an extra drive isn't like a big deal as long as you have the slots for it. So anyways, I was talking about performance in D5 and what that actually looks like. So I'm going to open up one of my recent tutorial videos. You see here, this is the frame rate. I've got a bunch of stuff in here, and I know I have a bunch of stuff in here because of the statistics telling me that I've got 1.5 billion faces, because I've got so much scatter in this scene. I've got like a whole forest. So that's where that's coming from, right? So although it's like a simple scene, your scatter and your trees are going to completely balloon this. So obviously you want the highest number as possible. So this is still running pretty smooth, but if this was like 4 or 5, you wouldn't want to use this. This would be like miserable. And basically this is a real-time rendering engine. So we should be able to see results in real time. We should be able to fly around in real time. You don't want a choppy experience. So this is why the specs are so important. And this is why that super resolution and FPS booster that I was talking about is really nice that you get from the NVIDIA tech. So the FPS booster, if you haven't used it, I don't know, D5 uses some AI magic in the background, and it basically like doubles this. It's insane. So always toggle that on, but you want this to be as high as possible, and upgrading your GPU, your RAM, and your CPU will allow that. Okay. You know, recently at work, we've run into this issue where, you know, some of our laptops just can't even open up D5 scenes because they get so large. We actually just don't even have enough RAM in them. And by just simply adding more RAM sticks, we've completely fixed the issue. So stuff like that, you know, if things start acting up, things are running slowly, think about upgrading your hardware. You guys can always drop a comment and ask me, you know, my opinion on a piece of hardware. But generally speaking, I feel like if you want to be in the recommended kind of spec zone of D5, I think like $2,000 USD is probably where you'll be. You know, obviously if something's on sale, like that's a phenomenal sale, is less than that, that's totally fine. But make sure you're sticking to 32 gigs of RAM and above. The GPU, you know, this is really going to vary. I mean, you could probably get a killer sale, you know, when the 5000s are out, but I probably wouldn't go below anything with a 60. And I think a 60 is a little low. I know it's like a fantastic card, but D5 and any real-time rendering engine, not just D5, can be really demanding. I mean, it's like you're essentially running a video game on your computer. So the higher this can be, go for it. I think this is where you want to spend your money. So if we're talking about like a couple $100 jump to go from the 60 to the 70, then to the 80, spend the money there. Okay. The CPU, obviously very important, but this is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck because this is all GPU based, right? Like this is what's determining your frame rate to the highest degree, right? If you upgrade your CPU, you'll see gains, right? I'm not saying you're not, but the GPU, it's going to be like night and day difference, right? Anyways, recap on this video. D5 has these phenomenal tools. They've got the benchmark tool that shows you other people's machines. So like if you're scoping out a piece of hardware and you're curious, you know, how it performs, just drop it in here and you can see like, you know, the 4090 was 20 seconds. Here you're at about 35 seconds. So is it a big deal? Yes or no? It's how I kind of justify spending money on PC components is like, I make my money on my PC. If I can perform jobs faster, that's money in my pocket, right? If I'm waiting a minute for a rendering, right, and I do 100 renderings in a day, right, that's a lot of time that I'm using just like sitting here watching this. If I could cut that in half, now I have half that time. I can go hang out with my family. I can go do something else. I don't need to be chained to this computer, right? As much as I love being here, right? But that's my point. It's like you have to balance that. So, you know, an extra $100 to make you a couple $100, totally worth it. So keep that in mind, and also pay attention to the frame rate. Okay, higher is better. But again, if you use the guidelines I've just shared, you guys will have a great machine. But always keep an eye out for sales and make sure you're using the filters. I feel like it makes it so much easier to actually just buy something. And then one last thing on laptops and desktops, do not get something with integrated graphics. You might see that and you're like, oh wow, this is a great deal. What that's basically saying is like the CPU has got like a little baby GPU in it, right? And that is going to do the rendering work for you. That's not good. It's for the type of work we need a dedicated card that just focuses on rendering. You don't want to split the CPU between all the other stuff it's doing and rendering, okay? I feel like that's where a lot of people get screwed a little bit. You know, I notice, you know, I teach at a college, and a lot of the freshmen come in, they've got their laptops, they're so happy, and then you look at the specs and it's integrated and they're like, oh, well, why is everything so slow? And it's like, well, that's the reason, right? You don't have an actual GPU that's doing all this heavy lifting. So like if I were to just search for graphics, you'll see it's going to be so much cheaper. Yeah, I mean, like this is the difference between like a regular normal person's laptop and like a gaming laptop, right? So that's really the difference. When we're talking about like a gaming desktop or laptop, we're talking about having a GPU. All these like really thin laptops and everything typically don't. The other thing, I see this all the time. People ask, oh, is D5 available on Mac? And the answer is no, right? And it's not because like, oh, D5 hates Mac, right? It's actually because of the technology that all the real-time rendering stuff is built on, DirectX. That doesn't exist on Mac. So those libraries don't exist, so it can't run on it, right? A little fun fact, the X in Xbox comes from DirectX, right? So give you a little tidbit there. But that's actually the reason, and that's why the requirements is Windows, right? So again, you know, maybe at some point that changes, but that's the real reason why that's happening. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this video. I know it's a little different, but I feel like this comes up all the time, like on the Discord, my YouTube comments, you know, people always asking like, what do I buy? So I hope this answers everything. If it doesn't, drop a question in the comments, leave a like. And if you like this content, please subscribe. Happy to have you here. See you guys next time.